Welcome back to Hugging the Cactus, a Mel Gibson podcast. And today we take flight with Air America. "1990s Air America", written by Christopher Robbins. This is a non-fiction book about a very serious subject. So let's make a comedy about it. The screenplay was done by John Esco, who is famous for the screenplays for Pink Cadillac and The Mask of Zorro. Really the guy you want making a very political script and making light of the situation. Richard Cush did a script polish. Richard Cush is mainly a guy you hire for TV shows, improving the script to the point where it's actually filmable. Carol Coe produced this film. People familiar with our channel and familiar with our podcast know who Mario Kassar and Andrew Vanya are. They ruled the late 80s and the early 90s with their big budget action films. This is one of them. This is a big action film with some humor to it. They contracted Roger Spottiswoode for this film. You may know Roger from Stop or My Mom Will Shoot, unfortunately. Well, we can't all shoot straight. He also did Tomorrow Never Dies, so, well, let's call that a redemption. Cinematography was done none other by Roger Deakins. I only have to give you some names. Shawshank Redemption, The Big Lebowski, Sicario, Skyfall. He's a big deal, and it shows. The score was done by Charles Gross. I love Charles Gross because he did the score to Call to Glory, the TV show. Anybody who lived through the 80s and watched that show loves that. He also did Turner and Hooch, again with Roger Spottiswoode. This was a big budget affair. They had $35 million to spend, and it shows just for all the wrecking of all the planes. They raked in a decent amount of money. They almost doubled it. The box office worldwide was $57.7 million. Domestic was $31 million, and this did fantastic on video. It's in fact one of the videos I've watched the most. I used to watch this a lot, basically because the soundtrack is incredible. This is one of those Vietnam movies that has a great soundtrack, like Platoon or any of the other ones. This movie stars Mel Gibson, of course. It stars Robert Downey Jr. It stars Nancy Travis, David Marshall Grant, and Lane Smith. Now, do I have to explain that this movie came out of developmental hell? No, of course not. It was produced by Carol Coe, and they have a habit of picking up scripts that seem unfilmable. This script was developed in 1985 during the Vietnam movie craze, when everybody was shooting a Vietnam movie. Director Richard Rush was originally attached. It was designed to be a light comedy, kind of like MASH, because it dealt with serious subject matter, and the easiest way to make that palatable and make that somehow entertainment is to make light of it. Originally, it would star Sean Connery. The original co-stars were, at different times, Bill Murray, James Belushi, and even Kevin Costner. Nancy Travis ultimately replaced Ali Sheedy. Michael Dudikoff, of American Ninja fame, was originally cast as General Lee. His scenes were cut, unfortunately. The script and the project was really sold to Daniel Melnick when Connery and Costner became too expensive. And ultimately, he managed to convince Carol Coe to actually produce and market this film. The budget typically spiraled way out of control, as Vietnam movies tend to do. They shot in 49 different locations throughout Thailand, throughout London, and also in LA with a crew of almost 500 people. This production was plagued by the elements. There was even an earthquake, 6.1 on the Richter scale, and they had a typhoon. They had problems with their flyers. The original stunt flyers balked at some of the stunts, so they drafted veterans to do the really hard turns and the weird landing, which we will talk about in a minute. Mel did a ton of press work for this. Typically, he ended up on Bobby Wiggins and many others. In one of his interviews, he actually jokes that he went out for a bike ride and he ended up on the wrong side of the border. He ended up in Burma, and he makes light of it, of course, typically Mel, saying that, yeah, he could have ended up a political prisoner. But he does, of course, sing the praises of Thai culture, basically saying, where else could you find a populace that finds it a disgrace to lose their temper? Decided to take a different approach to this movie. I could go beat for every scene. Because I've seen it 30 times, I wouldn't even have to have a script to do it. But I've decided to make it a little bit more interesting because I own the DVD with director's commentary, which kind of fills in a lot of the questions and blanks you would have about a project like this. So I thought, well, why not do a review on the actual director's commentary instead of just the movie? Because, like I said, I've seen this so many times. I know every scene and every line by heart. So this would make it a kind of novel experience for me. So Spottiswoode credits executive producer Daniel Melnick for all the work he put in. It was really kind of his baby. He is the one who kind of rescued this from the pits of developmental hell, as they say. The film shows that this was an insanely large undertaking. As I said, it's 49 different locations. This movie is crazy. The first plane you see is the C-123 transport plane, the workhorse of Air America. They show, in the opening scene, they show rice sacks being dropped, and that would typically be done over Laotian villages. To give you some idea of the setting, this is the early 70s when Nixon is in the White House trying to get America out of the Vietnam War. And he does this by escalating it, by expanding the war, not just in Vietnam, through a major bombing campaign in North Vietnam, but also by bombing the VC and the North Vietnamese who are basically using the open borders with Laos and Cambodia to evade American troops. So they start bombing basically outside of Vietnam. This was done in secret. The CIA, of course, set up shop in Laos. And this is really what this movie is about. What the CIA is in fact doing in this part of the world, unbeknownst to the taxpayer. Now, what they're doing in the first few scenes is dropping rice on villages, winning hearts and minds. They're also dropping pigs, live pigs with parachutes. One of the directors that would have been attached to this project was Bob Rafelson. Developed some of it, but ended up being replaced by Spottiswoode. And he actually conceived this opening scene. You see what they call the kipper, which is the guy who pushes the produce or whatever cargo they have out of the bay doors. This is a pretty dangerous gig. They usually give it to a local because a lot of those guys met with accidents. Well, you're pushing live hand grenades out of the bay doors, and you're doing that all the time with an unsecured line. That guy would just work back there, and if he was out of luck, he would just fall out of the plane. That stuff happened. In the movie, you see a scene where later on, where the guy handling the cargo actually falls out of the plane, but he climbs back in through a secured line. That's actually fiction. In reality, the guy would not have a parachute. He would not have a secured line. He'd just be dead. Welcome to the 70s. Mel's character is shown at the start of the movie watching a Nixon broadcast claiming there are no military forces in Laos, while he's sitting right in the middle of a CIA base. You see Mel running across the airfield, and this shows the scope of the operation because a plane is crashing. And this is part of another infamous opening scene where you just saw cargo being dropped, and then a local farmer who's walking in a field just takes a pot shot at the plane, hits something in the engine. engine starts to smoke, and the plane has to be ditched. It doesn't make it back to the airport, but you actually see it crash. And we are introduced to Rob. Rob is uh, Mel's character, Gene Ryek's boss, and he asks Gene, is he dead? Well, Rob, if he isn't dead, he's very still. So this is the kind of comedy we get from this movie. This is basically, it's a black comedy in many ways. And then we get a lot of exposition. Basically, Rob pats Gene's shoulder and says, look, we aren't here. That back there didn't happen. And so Gene responds with, well, maybe not, but it happened to Doug. And Rob starts complaining to his CIA colleague that all pilots are insane. And the response from the CIA guy is basically, well, yeah, but we're going to need a lot more of them. Since we're introducing characters, we are introduced to Billy Covington. Billy Covington is a helicopter pilot flying over LA, reporting on traffic jams. This is kind of the kind of weather report. And Billy Covington is a very entertaining helicopter pilot and explains to the listening audience that, yes, this massive traffic jam that's happening on the LA freeway is all caused by a truck driver. And while he's doing that, he's actually picking a fight with him. He gets in a shouting match. They say some bad words you aren't allowed to say on the air. And of course, people in the radio station are freaking out. On the director's commentary, Spottiswoode remarks that our friend Robert Downey Jr. was doing, well, copious amounts of marijuana at the time. If you've seen the movie as often as I have, you are very familiar with the stoned face of Robert Downey, who is basically baked in, well, every scene. But it doesn't make the movie any worse. In fact, it makes it better. We all know how talented Robert Downey Jr. is, whether he's on drugs or off them. And this is one of the first films we can really see his talents on display. So Billy Covington gets his wings clipped because, you know, making a problem of yourself above the LA freeway is, well, a good way to get fired quick. And this is shown to us in probably the coolest way to open your mail in a movie that's ever been done. I highly recommend you watch this. This is how I opened my mail after this movie. So apparently Robert Downey had a lot of problems with this role because Billy Covington is the driving force of the movie. We see everything through his eyes. We discover what the CIA is up to, what the pilots are really doing there, what the course of the war is like, and pretty much everything that happens is through his forced perspective. Downey felt he was boxed in because of this, because all the other actors would have a lot more freedom, but he didn't, because he was basically, in many ways, the narrator of the movie. So Billy is recruited by the CIA to go fly in Southeast Asia. It sounded good at the time, but by the time he gets there, well, he has a kind of rough introduction. There's the pilot briefing that happens often. The CIA briefs these men. They play a tape that these pilots are supposed to play over the war zone, which is a tape of war sounds, screaming, and the pilots are complaining not just because they have to do these sorties, but because it's embarrassing. And they question the CIA, and the CIA basically says, "Look, top psychologists put this stuff together. This is to basically weaken the resolve of the enemy." All pilots question this, but the only one who has a rational way of dealing with the situation is Gene Ryek, who's kind of the unofficial leader of the pilots. At that point, Billy is introduced. Basically, he introduces himself, and one of the pilots takes his bat from him and says, "Well, where are you from?" And he says, "Well, LA, and you?" "And I'm from the dark side of the moon, and I'll be returning very soon." Basically, these pilots are all nutso. Gene steps in and introduces himself, and he explains that the psychotic behavior these pilots are displaying is normal, everyday stuff here. Spottiswoode adds to this that Robert and Mel actually formed a friendship right from the onset, which is typical. They're two peas in a pod, really. They like their substances at that point. Mel is still a raging alcoholic. Robert Downey is uh, into the leaf and all kinds of other stuff. So why wouldn't they enjoy partying together? But ultimately, even Spottiswoode remarks that Mel became a very helpful presence to Robert in his life. Gene in the movie, Gene Ryak, explains that to Billy Covington, he's tasked with initiating him that there are 400 flights a day. They each carry about 100 ton of cargo with either food or ammo or troops. And Spottiswoode adds to that you really need actors of this kind of caliber who can do something with that kind of dialogue, because this is all exposition. This is basically stuff the audience needs to know to understand what's happening, to drive the story forward. But it's not exact. There's no joke in there, and there's nothing riveting happening. So they have to make it entertaining in some way. All the stunts in this movie are still considered state of the art. It's some of the best flying that's ever been done in any movie. It really stands on its own as a airplane movie in many ways, as a kind of a Top Gun for transport planes. So the initial flight happens. Gene is packing an Uzi, and as they're flying, Billy asks Gene, "Excuse me, is that an Uzi?" And Gene picks up on this and says, "You know that would make a great recruitment line. Excuse me, is that an Uzi?" "It sure is. Self-defense is no joke. That's why I only use an Uzi." So the kicker, um, or the cargo handler, which is, I don't know, the third pilot, says to Gene, "Hey, show him your amulet." So Gene shows him his amulet, which is a bullet, and it's filled with ashes of his own big toe that's been shot off through the cockpit. And so Billy, still not comprehend that he's actually in a war zone, that he's in a war. He thinks he's just here to do food drops. "Your plane got shot at?" And so they don't actually answer this. They just start talking about the toe. And at some point he asks, "Well, why didn't you just sew your toe back on?" And Gene says, "Well, it once it's off, you might as well part with it." And he calls that a Taoism, which is a wordplay on Taoism. And again, we get the kind of comedy this movie has. And okay, so this is the most successful comedy ever done. These men really aren't comedians, they're dramatic actors, but they have a script with dad jokes in it that they somehow have to make interesting. So they're in this small, sporty little plane. Spottiswoode actually explains that they picked this plane because it's the only one capable of landing uphill, which is the first thing you see. You see the plane actually land, and it's landing uphill, which is, when you think about it, it's kind of freaky. People are coming out of the jungle, and Billy freaks out and grabs the Uzi, and well, he has to be reassured. No, 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 that these are just friends of my brother-in-law and his wife. This scene is actually shot in an actual town in North Thailand. Many of these extras are just people from the village, which is a common theme throughout this movie. And so this orientation flight that he's on is actually used to run guns for private gain. And Gene again explains, well, this is not a scam. This is a retirement plan. Because these people, all these pilots, they're not there officially. They get paid, but they don't have any kind of plan. There's nothing after when they come back home. So typically they start doing what their boss is doing, scamming the place. So in the next scene, you see Gene and the other pilot. You see them coloring books while Billy is flying the plane. Director Spottiswoode says that this came straight from research. He talked to the real pilots who would fly those missions, and this is what they did during those missions. They colored books as stress relief. So then we are introduced to the political element of this film. You see a scene where a U.S. senator arrives in the country and is greeted by the CIA and a local general. Now, this local general is infamous and is a maniac. And it certainly doesn't help that the senator in question, who is introduced as someone from the Midwest and kind of an idiot, he mistakes the general for a baggage handler and hands him his suit. Now, the general in question is actually the guy who played Kato in Peter Sellers' Pink Panther series. In a later scene, you see the senator discover the American pilots blowing off steam in a local barn in Vientiane. And this opens Spottiswood's big wound. His movie was lambasted. It got some really nasty reviews, 2-page reviews in the Wall Street Journal, which is kind of peculiar when you think about it. Movies generally aren't reviewed in things like the Wall Street Journal. That it's just peculiar. So you really have to wonder who was worried about this kind of thing. We are making a movie about the CIA and what they were actually up to. And Spottiswoode basically says, well, this was all based on the book and it was all reality. This is what those pilots were doing. If they weren't flying, they were drinking because it was a stressful job. They could die any moment. They could crash any moment. They could be shut down any moment. So again, Billy is used as the as our eyes and ears, and he is introduced by Rob. They're explaining to him, well, this is in this bar, this is where business is conducted. And he has business. I'm still getting used to being in a war because he wasn't supposed to be in Vietnam. He was supposed to be in peaceful Laos, and Laos is not officially at war. And so the CIA people basically tell him, well, who says they are two different things? They aren't. You just have to look at Ukraine to know. So you see the CIA walking into the Pepsi factory. Turns out to be a front for a heroin lab. And you get a lot more exposition about why heroin is important to the CIA and why it's important. It's this is how that general funds his army and how he stays in power. Spottiswoode adds that all the scenes with prostitutes in the bar, and they return to that bar many times, those are actual prostitutes. And his reasoning for that is that in Thailand, Thai actors will not play prostitutes. So faced with this problem, they decided to just recruit real ones from the streets of Bangkok. And they schlepped them all around the country. Interesting. So you basically see how these pilots are relaxing. And one of them actually built his own miniature golf course, which is very cute. They're drinking and they're playing miniature golf, and one of them has a gun and starts shooting at the miniature golf ball. They come to blows. This is apparently a nightly occurrence. This is normal. We shouldn't really find this strange at all. Again, through Billy's eyes, it's like, wow, you guys do this often? It's like, well, every day, basically, because you never know if you're going to be around tomorrow. So the next day, Billy Covington is hung over, and we get the iconic scene of Gene Ryak tying a rope around Billy Covington and lifting him up with a helicopter to take him back to the airport. There was no CGI back then. Apparently, Robert Downey was probably stoned enough that he agreed to do what they did. They actually hung him from a helicopter to shoot the close-ups. That's actually him. Now, whenever you don't see his face, obviously that's a stunt double, but all the close-ups, that's Robert Downey Jr. hanging from a helicopter. Now, Gene is ordered to pick up the senator, and the CIA wants him to dazzle the senator with bullshit. And then we get like this iconic little quote, which is, oh, you mean treat him like a mushroom, keep him in the dark, feed him shit, take a piss on him, which is actually an actual management system. It's called mushroom management. Keep him in the dark, keep him in the shit, watch them grow. It's basically leadership, not telling you what to do, and creating an environment where you either sink or swim. Now, to deal with this, this Gene Ryak is extremely Buddhist, and, well, it makes sense. All these pilots are superstitious in some way, so he has his plane ritually cleansed before the flight. While they're flying, the senator and the general get into an argument. The senator reassures him, look, we're pulling out of Asia, but we won't forget our friends. And he says, look, we'll take care of you. You'll get asylum. And so this general starts arguing. He says, what, you think I just want to be some liquor store owner? Kind of a cliche. So Gene intercedes and says, why don't you tell the general, why don't you tell the senator what you really want? Which is an obvious setup for a joke. And so the general says, well, I want a Holiday Inn owner and manager. And apparently they wanted Lane Smith's reaction to be genuine, and they had trouble getting this shot, and they had to do it 25 times. Think about that one. So the senator visits the refugee camp. Now, these camps kept shifting by the needs of the Air Force because obviously the bombing campaign, Operation Rolling Thunder, was in effect, and they kept shifting their targets. And of course, the enemy used the refugee crisis as a kind of screen. So this was part of warfare. So you see aid workers and particularly the main aid worker played by Nancy Travis deliver some exposition again. And Spottiswoode actually has a nice quote saying, if you make your actor deliver exposition with anger, then it's less obvious, which I thought was interesting. Now, the senator brings up the opium trade with the CIA later during dinner. Of course, they dazzle him with bullshit. And Spottiswoode says that he shot the scene to show how operatives like this come up with a quick cover story, how they would give up a few pilots as bad apples. So the next scene, we see Billy witnessing Sung loading drugs on his plane. Billy flies with Art, one of the crazier pilots of the bunch, and he starts talking about getting his golden BB, which is kind of their pilot slang for the bullet with your name on it. So at some point, Gene calls in from his helicopter flight, which is kind of interesting because if you've been in a helicopter, you know that you really can't understand anyone. But okay, so he calls about dinner reservations at Nino's, which is the local restaurant, at 9. They are serving lobster today. And right at that point, the plane is shot. You see them being shot at with flak guns. And this is apparently the general bringing down the plane so they can get to the heroin. Very strange way of doing things, but I'm told these things actually happened. So we get the crash sequence with Jack Neely as Art. Now, we all know Jack Neely as the captain for Lieutenant Cobra in the movie Cobra. And I really enjoy this because I think this is one of the funniest scenes in the movie where Art is convinced that this is it for him. He's going to get his golden BB. Billy has to convince him to jump out of the plane, which he's reluctant to do. So we get some great physical comedy. And ultimately, Billy crashes the transport plane. And they did this for real. So this is a stunt that was balked at by their stunt team. And so they had to get different pilots, and they landed this plane as displayed in the film. And then you get the basically long track shot of it's losing its wings and its engine getting blown up, and it getting ended up in a spin. Really, this stunt is one of the highlights of the entire project. That Spottiswoode actually credits this film as being one of the most life-changing films he's ever worked on. Probably because it was so hard. Because this is really a massive undertaking. He explains that they had 3 camera units working simultaneously to get all the shots in many different locations. They've called for help, and help does come, but not in the form they would want. It's General Sung who's landing, and he's there to pick up his opium. And he just leaves those pilots behind. Next is, of course, people in black pajamas showing up because, a plane is down, so, there's something to get there. And Gene Ryek arrives with a different plane just in time to pick them up. Spottiswoode again stresses that this movie had to be a comedy, otherwise the story would be too cynical and it would become completely unwatchable. Well, that's debatable, but there's something to be said for that, because they did have a TV show called MASH that ran for 10 15 years, which was also about very sensitive stuff of the Korean War. And if you can make a joke about it, well, it becomes more entertaining, right? Funny, haha. Anyway, Gene and Billy are in a helicopter and they are hit and they crash once again. This time the helicopter hangs nose down in a tree. This is actually where there's a major mistake. You see Mel Gibson's, really Gene Ryek's Buddha, and it's hanging in the wrong way, in the wrong direction. It's hanging up, not down. So, think of it this way: you're sitting strapped into a pilot seat, and your pendant, it would hang down because you're hanging down. But instead, in the scene, you see it hanging up. Oops. Okay, so there's another contrivance here. They drop out of the helicopter. Gene is shown injuring himself slightly. During filming, Mel Gibson had severe, and I mean severe, back problems. So they show him sprinting a couple of times to kind of suggest he's an action hero and he's very limber. But throughout most of the shoot, he was holding his back. You actually see a scene when he's coming out of the water where he's actually pressing into his lower back. This was most of the stuff they would do. I'm sure Mel's libations didn't exactly help his recovery, but nevertheless, they had a lot of shooting around action sequences, and this was quite a chore. The rest of the pilots are at that point looking for Gene and Billy, and you see like this soundtrack with Run Through the Jungle with Creedence Clearwater Revival, which is one of my favorite songs, actually. Spottiswoode again brings up that he doesn't see how he dishonored any dead American pilots by, showing the reality of how they operated. And the next scene we get is another great scene, a funny one, which is the two out-of-tune singers in the restaurant. It's two Asian gentlemen singing, and they're singing A Horse with No Name. They're completely out of tune. These are actually comedians from Thai television, and they're quite famous. At this point, the CIA are discussing the situation with the senator, or about the senator. He's isn't there, and Rob says, "Well, maybe we should just, get him a whore and have him blown." And so his CIA handler Saunders says, "No, this senator leads the prayer group. You don't offer a man like that blowjobs. You wait for him to bring it up." It's one of my favorite jokes in the movie. So Sung shows up. He closes the restaurant over a health violation, and he's pissed at the restaurant owner, Nino, because apparently Nino is his business partner. This is basically about the opium, and Nino didn't pay him enough. And so Nino says, "Yeah, that's all well and good, but your opium was mixed with baking powder this time, so you're not getting all the money." So the CIA intercedes on behalf of General Sung and says, "Well, without our planes flying this dope out of here, you won't have any profits to begin with." So Nino backs down. Meanwhile, Gene and Billy are captured by locals. Billy thinks they are the Kong, but Gene says, no. Commies would have AKs. These guys they have old French rifles, so this is a mountain tribe. And this provides actually an opening for negotiation. Because, of course, Gene runs guns. And so he's explaining to the locals in, let's say, Laotian, Hmong, probably, that their guns won't work in the rain. And this is actually a historical fact. The French, of course, had Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam as part of their colonial empire. It was called Indochine. And they would arm the local population with old muskets. Well, pretty soon those locals would realize that, in rain-heavy countries like Laos, those guns were pretty much worthless because the powder would just get wet and they wouldn't work. And this is actually this is proven because one of the locals actually fires into Gene's chest, and it doesn't go off. And so he explains, "Look, my brother-in-law has guns, and they are cherry." And so the locals are, "Well, okay, let's do a deal." Next up, we see Gene Ryek's home life. We see very little of it, even though a lot of it was shot. We get to meet Gene Ryek's wife, played by Sinjai Plenpanich, which is a famous movie star in Thailand. She actually had a really big part in this movie, but they cut out all of her scenes for brevity. This movie would have been 3 hours instead of the 2. At this point, Gene is basically warning Billy to just go home before he gets addicted to this whole thing. And he doesn't mean what they're both already addicted to, which is drugs and alcohol. But he says, no, you're going to get addicted to the danger of this kind of flying, and you'll never be able to do anything else. And he basically says, well, the rest is just stuck here, not just because they don't have any place else to go, but basically because they're just hooked on flying in a war. And so at this point, the senator is demanding names on a silver platter from the CIA, because of course he has to appease his committee. He's there for a reason. He has to bring something home. At this point, Art is the Jack Neely part is he's dead. You see him on a covered stretcher. This happens during a briefing when the CIA is explaining to the pilots that they have to start dropping oversized condoms to convince the locals that Americans are apparently hung like dinosaurs. But the pilots decide to observe a minute of silence because of obviously Art was beloved. And so then in the next scene, we see the senator complaining that he's been 6 hours in this local village. And Gene says, well, we're almost done. You see him, a local guy, carving something. And this General Sung is along and he's drunk. And he says, well, Gene, you're a strange man. You like the old ways, but, General Sung likes the new ones. And then he passes out. And Gene explains to the senator that, this general is high on America and he's seen it before. And we've seen it a lot since, haven't we? Apparently, Mr. Zelensky has very nice homes in Florida worth many millions. Apparently, the thing they were carving is necessary. It actually has a point. These pilots are there not officially, so they can't be brought home in body bags. They can't be brought home in caskets. There are no American flags. These people, they aren't there, and those pilots didn't die. So the only way to transport them back home in one piece is basically just to put them in some kind of piece of art or some kind of tourist souvenir. So this float they were carving is actually to carry the art's remains. At this point, Billy has become chagrined. He's bought hand grenades on the black market, and he decides to blow up the drug lab. During filming, Spottiswoode explains that they mistimed the explosion, and that both Robert Downey Jr. and the director both got pelted by the debris. Oops. He explains that tried to give a lot of backstory to the quote-unquote bad guys, because he says, well, those people wake up in the morning and they have a good reason for their actions. And in this case, they thought, well, we'll just trade heroin because that's the best way to defeat communism. During shooting, Mel was already preparing for his role in Hamlet, so he was reading a lot of Shakespeare along with Thai, because he had Thai lines. He wasn't a happy man because of it. Billy blew up the drug lab, and that's an open secret. And so, of course, Billy is selected as the patsy, as the bad apple in the bunch. And so Spottiswoode actually says, well, it's always, that's what they always say. It's always a few rotten apples that spoil the bunch. And he says it's a line of bullshit that will never end. And it doesn't, really. There's actually a heroin aboard the plane, unbeknownst to the pilots. And they are being rerouted for a quote-unquote routine check. And so Billy asks Babo, who is his co-pilot, what's this routine inspection thing? And he says, well, it doesn't exist. So obviously this is set up. So they start rifling through the flour sacks or whatever is in the back there, and they find the drugs. They decide not to cooperate. So they, at that point, they realize they're out of gas, because the CIA only put enough in to reach the airstrip where they want to search them. Billy takes a detour and flies to the old Japanese airstrip they landed on before. We get the sequence where they land and hide the small plane by driving it into the downed larger transport plane before the Hueys of the CIA show up. So at this point, Gene is doing one of his gun runs, and he gets a call. He has to go rescue Billy and Babo. At this point, get cutscenes because the refugee camp, which is near the general's poppy fields, the refugee camp is being attacked by General Sung and his troops. Gene picks them up. While they're there, he's actually just being forced to, more or less morally obligated to drop all his merchandise, his guns, that is his nest egg, and take all the refugees out of there instead. So this is kind of the moral climax of the movie. They get out in time, and you see Gene Ryak take a couple of hand grenades and blow up his army stash. At this point, they're all outlaws. And so Gene basically says to Billy, well, you get to be my co-pilot now because we're commandeering this plane and I'm going to have to get my money back. And the end of the movie is basically just typewritten. The CIA guy, Major Lamont, he's will later be indicted during the Iran-Contra investigation, and he will be pardoned and he will be promoted and he will be sent to Panama to help Noriega keep drugs out of America. It's pretty cynical. And we see how Rob Deal ends. He is called before the Senate again in the Iran-Contra scandal, and he repeats, "I have no clear memory of that, sir," about 115 times, which is kind of funny. General soon gets his Holiday Inn, and he's also involved in the California savings and loan scandal. And Gene Ryak wins the Thai lottery in 1975. And they also state that Billy Covington becomes a computer whiz and is deported in 1976 from Thailand for fixing the Thai state lottery. And that's all. That's the movie. It's a 2-hour movie, but it feels like a 90-minute movie. It's edited well. It's action-packed. Most of the jokes work. Air America, in its own ways, is brilliant. It does depict the latter stages of America's involvement in Southeast Asia like no other movie really has done. Most Vietnam movies just focus on the military side of things, on the tactical side, under the pretense of depicting the reality of war. Air America shows its seedy underbelly. Air America underperformed basically because of bad timing. Desert Storm was happening around the time this movie was coming out, and everybody was waving the flag, and nobody wanted to hear about, what Halliburton and Blackwater were about to perpetrate in the next few war zones. And just in the same way that nobody wants to know why there's really a war in the Ukraine. It's all connected, and it's all connected to the same 3-letter agencies that in some ways rule the world. So there you have it. They made a interesting movie about it that was supposed to be entertaining by being a comedy, but none of the official critics liked it, even though audiences did flock to this movie. Plenty of people saw it, but ever since it has been somewhat of a lost gem. And I'm here to tell you that this movie is really worth watching. There's really no fat on this film. It's very well done. Mel's great in it. In many ways, this is a star vehicle for Mel Gibson, who at that point is coming into his own. This is after Lethal Weapon 2, but before Braveheart. So what we see here really is an Lethal Weapon 2 made him an A-lister. Next up is, of course, Hamlet, and then Braveheart, and that really sets him on the path to pretty much becoming the king of Hollywood. This movie is pivotal because it also stars Robert Downey Jr., and it introduced Mel Gibson and Robert Downey Jr. If that hadn't happened, if Robert Downey Jr. at some point after seeing Lethal Weapon hadn't said to his agent, "Hey, get me in a movie with Mel Gibson," which the agent apparently took seriously, Mel wouldn't have gotten him clean, and there would have been no Iron Man, and therefore no MCU. And without the MCU, there would be no superhero franchise with tentpole movies, and the current movie landscape would look very different. I'm not sure how different, but it's hard to imagine the MCU from the past 10, 15 years not happening. What would we have gotten instead? A continuation of the films that were made in the 90s, perhaps? Who knows? All the money wouldn't have gone down the drain. It would have gone into art. So is it a positive thing that Mel and Robert Downey Jr. got together? Who knows? History plays strange tricks on us sometimes. Anyway, that's it for today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye for now.